Some stories don't need drama, they just need warmth. This is the story of a man who lost his wife, a little girl who had never said mum, and a woman who came to a small town with a quiet burden on her shoulders, hoping to find her way back to life. In the kitchen of a place called June's Light, love didn't begin with a glance, but with a bowl of soup, a nod, and a small hand drawing the word family in the air. If you've ever grieved, ever stood still, unsure how to come home, let this story keep you company. June's Light, where love begins again without words. Rain had been falling quietly since the night before. It was the kind of Oregon rain that didn't crash or pour, just lingered softly like a sad melody you've heard 1,000 times. In the small diner called June's Light, the droplets tapping on the wooden roof sounded almost like a spoon stirring gently in a warm bowl of soup. Caleb McAllister was used to mornings like this. He always woke before dawn, turned on the kitchen lights, brewed his coffee, and checked the ingredients he'd prepped the night before. His hands, once firm in high-end restaurant kitchens, now moved peacefully over onions and corn kernels, as if each motion whispered to someone who was gone. The wooden sign on the front door was still damp. Its faded letters never replaced June's Light. Homemade meals with heart. He named the place to keep a piece of her. June, his wife, who once believed that every meal could heal if it was made with true love. She passed away 2 years ago during a heart surgery Caleb never fully understood. The doctors called it a sudden complication. The report said anaphylactic shock. But those words never captured a woman who lived like light and vanished into darkness too suddenly. Since then, Caleb had left the world of restaurants behind, moved to Ridgefield, and opened this little place. Just a few wooden tables, wedding photos of him and June on the wall, and a small corner reserved for their only daughter, Leah. Tiny footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, soft as a cat's. Caleb didn't turn around. He knew who it was. Leah, 6 years old, stood quietly in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room. Her hair slightly messy, hugging a blank sketchbook and a crayon box with a broken lid. She stepped forward slowly without a word, her eyes shimmering in the soft yellow kitchen light. Caleb bent down, pulled out her usual stool beside the table and patted the seat. Leah understood. She climbed up. No one needed to speak. The silence between father and daughter wasn't cold, it was its own language. She opened her notebook and started to draw. First, soft curved lines. Then came light blues and pale yellows. Caleb didn't look right away. He was still stirring a pot of soup on the stove, corn and lotus seed soup, the one June used to call a bowl of light. The scent filled the kitchen. Awakening senses Caleb thought had long gone numb. When he turned around, Leah had nearly finished a simple yet touching drawing, 2 people under an umbrella in the rain, one tall, one small, standing side by side. Caleb looked at his daughter, then at the drawing. She didn't speak, but her eyes asked silently, "Do you understand, Dad?" He gave a gentle nod. No words needed. He understood. Leah picked up the crayon box again and added one last detail, a street lamp shining light down on the 2 figures. She used yellow coloring it with great care. Caleb felt his throat tighten. In the rain, light was the only thing that kept them close. And in his daughter's silent world, that light was a kind of faith that Mum was still somewhere and Dad was trying to keep everything whole. He turned back to the kitchen, ladled hot soup into a brown ceramic bowl and set it in front of Leah. She didn't rush. She touched the bowl's edge, felt the warmth, then smiled, a silent smile, but enough to ease something deep inside Caleb. He sat beside her and ate. A father, a daughter, a bowl of soup, a drawing, and a silence as warm as an old quilt. Outside, the rain still fell. But inside this little kitchen, time seemed to stop. After breakfast, Leah walked over and pinned her picture to the wall where over 24 others already hung. No one had taught her this, but every morning she chose one drawing and put it up, like a quiet ritual, as if the light of the day had to be placed on the wall so they wouldn't forget. Caleb washed the dishes, wiped down the counters, and unlocked the front door. The sky was still grey, no sun, but when the first customer stepped in, an elderly woman in a velvet coat, Leah was already at table 3, sketching something new. She looked up and gave a polite nod, a tiny nod, but enough to make the woman smile.
She doesn't speak, but she's more polite than any of my grandkids.
Caleb smiled, brought her a cup of ginger tea and the last piece of leftover cake from the night before. He glanced at his daughter, the quiet girl who neither spoke nor wrote, but who was teaching him there were other ways to love, to remember, and to live. And he didn't yet know that just a few hours from now, the door would open for a woman carrying past that had never been forgiven. A different kind of rain was coming, not from the sky, but from the heart. Ridgefield is the kind of town where time moves like underground water, quiet, steady, without flair. Every morning when the church bell rings for the first time, a few doors creak open, a few trucks start their engines. Familiar faces pass by the wooden porch of June's light without looking because they already know Caleb is in the kitchen, and the soup today will be just a little different from yesterday's, but still warm enough to make anyone stay. Caleb's kitchen is small, but everything has its place. On the wall hangs an old round clock next to a paper calendar with a red circle around the date of June's passing and a few handwritten recipes pinned neatly with wooden tacks. He keeps everything the way it was when June was still alive. Even her favorite teacup remains untouched on the highest shelf. Every morning starts with soup, not because it's the easiest dish, but because it was June's favorite. Corn and lotus seed simmered, pumpkin mashed carrots, sometimes white bean with roasted garlic. Caleb doesn't need a recipe for any of them. His hands remember every measurement, every step, every time June scrunched her nose and laughed because he added too much pepper. Leah is always the first to appear by his side in the kitchen. She doesn't speak, doesn't call out, she simply shows up, light as a shadow, carrying her blank sketchbook and that little box of crayons. Caleb always reserves a corner of the table for her with a neatly folded napkin and a warm glass of milk. Each day, Leah draws a picture, no words, no explanation, just thick and thin lines of wax swirling through her imagination. Sometimes a frying pan with eggs, sometimes a bubbling soup pot, sometimes a woman with long hair standing in the sunlight. Caleb has never asked who the woman is. He knows. And he doesn't want to break the fragile thread between Leah and June, the last thing left after the storm called losing Mom. After a simple breakfast, usually soup and toast with butter, Caleb opens the diner at exactly 7. As soon as the wind chime above the door jingles for the first time, familiar customers begin to trickle in. The first is usually Mr. George, a grumpy old veteran, but he always brings a coloured pencil for Leah. He doesn't talk much, just sits quietly, orders soup, reads the paper, and sometimes glances at Leah with the kind of eyes only someone who lost a granddaughter 10 years ago would have. Leah always bows slightly to him, takes the pencil, and places it in a wooden box with her name carved on it, a gift Caleb made from the bookshelf June once used. Then come Linda and Martha, the elderly couple who run the flower shop at the corner. They arrive at 8:30, always order chamomile tea and cookies, and sit at table 3, June's old spot. Linda was a schoolmate of June's, and every time she sees Leah, her eyes well up.
She looks just like her mother, especially the eyes.
Caleb only nods and smiles softly. He doesn't speak, but his eyes follow Leah, sometimes too long, long enough that the soup pot boils dry without him noticing. One quiet weekday afternoon, after the lunch crowd had gone, Leah brought a new drawing to her father. She didn't say a word, just placed it on the counter. A man washing dishes, a child drawing beside him, and above them a round lamp casting light in the shape of a heart. Caleb looked at the picture, then at his daughter, then bent down and gently patted her shoulder. Leah didn't respond. She simply stepped back, sat down, and went back to colouring her older drawings. Afternoons were for cleaning the kitchen and prepping ingredients for tomorrow. Leah would sit peeling potatoes or picking greens, Not because anyone asked, she simply watched her father, saw what he did and quietly copied. Those small actions, so small, but to Caleb they were his daughter's way of saying, "I'm still here, Dad." One day, while checking the cold pantry, Caleb found Leah standing silently in the corner, hugging the old wooden cat her mother used to keep beside the altar. She wasn't crying, but her little hands gripped so tightly they turned pale. Caleb walked over, sat down, and placed his hand on her back. Leah didn't look up, but she leaned against him, rested her head on his shoulder for the first time in many months. They said nothing. But in that quiet moment, Caleb understood, even if loss couldn't be undone, presence was still a miracle. On late nights after the diner closed, Caleb and Leah often folded napkins together. He taught her how to make them into flowers, stars' hearts. She wasn't great at it, but she kept trying. Every time she messed up, she looked up at him and tried again. No daddy, no words, but her eyes said everything. Sometimes before bed, Leah would hand Caleb a newly drawn picture as if to say good night. A slow, simple drawing filled with warm colors, a world with no words, yet brimming with unspoken things. Caleb hung those drawings all over the diner, not because they were pretty, but because they reminded him, even if he couldn't hear his daughter's voice, he had to learn how to understand her. Ridgefield stayed lightly rainy all week, but inside the little diner between the warm kitchen fire and the hands of a father and daughter baking side by side, light still glowed, not blinding, but just enough to thaw the corners of a frozen heart. And Caleb didn't yet know that this thin thread of peace was about to pull tight when the past he thought buried in ashes would return in the form of a woman walking through the rain, carrying a mistake that had never been forgiven. There are roads that don't exist on any map, destinations that were never planned, and meetings that seem random until you realize they were guided by wounds no one else could see. Eva Beaumont never thought she'd end up in Ridgefield. She knew nothing about the town. She had no friends there, no reason to drive 40 miles north from Portland to reach a place so small it appeared on maps as barely a faded dot. But that morning she woke up at 5:30, just like every morning for the past 7 months, with a heavy weight pressing on her chest. She stood by the window of her 11th floor apartment looking out at rain-slick rooftops, her eyes blank like a street lamp that hadn't yet turned off. Beside her sat a cold cup of tea, an open medical notebook still on last night's page, and a torn prescription for tranquilizers she never filled. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from Sam, her best friend and former colleague. The latest message read only, "Eva, talk to someone. Me, a doctor. Yourself. Don't keep disappearing like this." Eva locked her screen. She didn't want to talk. Not to anyone. Not now. She grabbed a coat, tossed a few personal items into her leather bag, picked up her car keys, and stepped out. No message, no destination. All she knew was if she stayed in that apartment 5 more minutes, she'd explode. The highway carried her north past misty fields and damp forest roads. The wind slipped through her half-open window, and the scent of wet earth mixed with pine hit her chest like a quiet ache. For the first time in months, she felt a kind of clarity, not from meds, not from sleep, but from simply leaving everything familiar behind. When the wooden sign reading "Welcome to Ridgefield" appeared through the drizzle, Eva didn't think. She slowed down, turned onto a gravel road and drove past rows of wooden houses barely visible in the fog. The town was eerily quiet, no big chains, no neon billboards, just wooden awnings, moss-covered stone walls, and brick paths damp with rain. Eva passed a bakery, a pharmacy, and stopped when she saw a little diner nestled between a flower shop and an old hardware store. On the glass door, a handwritten sign read, "June's Light, homemade meals with heart." Nothing flashy, but a soft, warm glow spilled out from inside, just enough to make Eva forget the rain still tapping on her windshield. She stepped out, pulled her scarf tighter, and walked slowly toward the door. The wind chime jingled softly as it opened. Instantly, the scent of corn soup, fried onions, and warm ginger wrapped around her, and her stomach tightened with instinctive hunger. The man behind the counter looked up, late 30s, maybe 40, trimmed beard, a wooden ladle in hand, his eyes careful but not cold.
Hi there. Would you like to sit by the window or inside?
By the window, if that's okay.
He nodded and pointed to a small table near a miniature bookshelf. Eva took off her coat and sat down, her eyes scanning the children's drawings on the walls, the neatly folded napkins, the plain white ceramic bowls without logos. A few moments later, a small girl approached her table, about 6 years old, black hair, round cheeks, holding a sketchbook and a box of crayons. She stood there staring, not shy, not bold, just present like an unspoken question. Eva looked down a little surprised. She smiled gently and tilted her head in greeting. The girl didn't respond. Instead, she lifted the sketchbook open to a page with a pencil and watercolor drawing, 2 people sitting across from each other, a steaming bowl of soup between them. Eva touched the edge of the paper. She didn't know what to say. Something in her throat tightened, a feeling she hadn't felt in a very long time. The man, clearly the owner, walked over and placed a steaming bowl of corn and lotus seed soup in front of her, along with 2 slices of buttered toast.
Today's special. Give it a try.
Eva looked down at the soup, then back at the drawing. She didn't ask questions. But deep inside, things she thought she had buried began to stir. The girl remained standing there, didn't leave, didn't say a word. Eva placed her hand over her chest and nodded gently, a quiet, instinctive gesture of thanks without words. The girl stepped back to her drawing table, but her eyes still followed Eva. Eva ate slowly. The soup tasted like something familiar she couldn't place, like the old fireplace at her grandmother's house, like the meal her mother once made on a rainy day, like a hug she used to think she didn't need anymore. It didn't melt the ice in her chest, but it softened it just enough for the warmth to seep in. When she finished, Eva brought her tray back to the counter. She didn't say much, just looked at Caleb, gave a quiet nod, and turned to leave. Before stepping out, she glanced back, saw the child drawing again, coloring yellow into a street lamp in the picture. No pleading look, no accusing expression, just presence, and that presence made Eva feel seen, not as a doctor, not as someone who had failed, but simply as a person. She stepped back into the cold. Rain still fell, the wind bit at her cheeks, but strangely, she didn't feel cold. For the first time in months, Eva didn't drive home right away. She parked in an empty lot at the edge of town and sat in her car for another hour, not doing anything, not thinking, just letting the feeling soak in. And she knew she would come back. That afternoon, Ridgefield seemed wrapped in a sheet of thin glass, cold, damp and cloudy. The light rain didn't fall straight, but floated sideways, drifting lazily between bare branches like cigarette smoke breathed into the sky. June's light turned its lights on earlier than usual. Caleb stood in the kitchen drying ceramic cups one by one. From time to time, his eyes flicked toward the front window where Leah sat, as always, at the table by the door, drawing with her worn-down box of crayons. She always drew when it rained. No one had taught her that. Maybe the slow-moving drops outside stirred something unnamed in her, like memories from another life. Close to 4 o'clock, the wind chime at the door gave a soft tinkle, as if someone had opened the door just to quietly step into a dream. Caleb looked up, and something in his chest stilled when he saw the woman walk in. It was her, the woman from the day before, the one whose eyes looked like they were holding the world together by sheer will. Eva. She stepped inside a little hesitant, scanning the diner as if to make sure it still looked the same as yesterday. The golden light, the warm wood tables, the scent of corn soup, and that strange, fragile feeling that maybe all kinds of loss could be soothed here, even if only for an hour. Leah was the first to notice. She looked up from her drawing and locked eyes with Eva. Without being told, Leah left her chair, walked over and stopped a few steps away, then held out a small object, a pink heart-shaped eraser. Eva knelt slightly, accepted it, and smiled a rare smile, not born from politeness, but from someplace deeper. Caleb stayed in the kitchen watching. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt, but the towel in his hands twisted tighter.
Hi again. Leah, right?
She knew the girl couldn't answer, but Eva was used to speaking into silences. In medicine, you often had to learn how to talk to people who couldn't respond, people in comas, people at the end, or yourself in the mirror. Leah didn't reply, didn't look away. She gently took hold of Eva's coat sleeve and led her back to the same table. No words, no wasted gestures, but there was no mistaking it. She wanted Eva to stay. She needed to be here. Eva sat down. Caleb, after a moment of stillness, turned back to the stove and began preparing a new bowl of soup, this time adding cilantro, a quiet test to see if she remembered the taste. Leah dragged her chair closer to Eva's and opened her sketchbook to a fresh page. She started drawing faster than usual, her pencil strokes swirling like a flowing stream. Eva didn't ask anything, but each time Leah paused, Eva tilted her head gently as if to say, "Go on, I'm still here." The drawing took shape, a woman standing in the rain, her arms open slightly as if to catch each drop. No umbrella, no one beside her. But at her feet, tiny flowers had begun to bloom, as though the rain hadn't just soaked her but given her life. Eva stared at the picture, then at Leah. She couldn't understand how a 6-year-old who didn't speak could draw something that mirrored her so perfectly. Maybe it was because Leah lived in her own rain too, and was still learning how to bloom in it. Caleb brought out the soup, setting it gently in front of Eva. He didn't meet her gaze, but his voice was warm.
I added cilantro this time. Hope it didn't ruin it.
It makes it more real. Thank you.
Caleb gave a quiet nod and returned to the kitchen. But before he left, he glanced at Leah, still focused on her drawing, and he realized his daughter had never sat that close to anyone else, had never drawn that quickly, had never offered anything to someone outside of him. An hour passed. Eva finished her meal, but the rain didn't. She stood, walked to the counter to pay, then turned back to Leah's table and leaned down.
Thank you for the drawing. I'm not very good, but if you'll let me, maybe one day I'd like to learn.
Leah looked up, said nothing, but she reached into her pocket and took out a small piece of white chalk, the kind used on little blackboards, and placed it in Eva's hand. Caleb saw it from the kitchen. He paused mid-dish, standing completely still. Something inside him began to stir, not an alarm, but a faint crack in the wall he'd built. Eva stepped out of the diner, the chalk in her palm feeling warm like a sun-drenched pebble. She turned and glanced back through the window. Leah was seated again, eyes still following her. And for the first time since the surgery that made her leave medicine, since the last time she pulled a needle from someone's skin, Eva thought about returning. Not to her profession, but to herself. People in Ridgefield didn't usually pay attention to strangers unless the stranger showed up more than 3 times in a week. And Eva had passed that threshold in under 10 days. She never came at the same hour, but always sometime in the late morning or early afternoon, when the diner quieted, when Caleb could rest his hands for a few minutes, and when Leah had already started on her second page of the day. Eva walked in as if she'd never left. No cheerful greetings, no explanations. She simply sat at her usual spot by the window, unwrapped her scarf, and smiled gently as Leah pulled her chair beside hers. For the first time, Caleb noticed something strange. Leah seemed to know Eva would return. Each morning she picked out 2 napkins folded into stars and placed them side by side, one for herself, one for Sister Eva. Then she'd draw 2 bowls, one big, one small, next to each other, colored in soft yellow and pale blue. Caleb had never seen Leah prepare like that for anyone. Not for Sam, his closest friend, not for Linda, the one who once gifted her a whole box of crayons, only for Eva. As if there was a silent pact between them that no adult could see. On the 4th day, Eva returned. Caleb was slicing carrots in the kitchen when he heard a soft laugh. Not Leah's, of course, but Eva's. He looked up and saw her fumbling through a napkin folding lesson led by Leah. The girl pointed signed fold, bend, turn. Eva followed, seriously failing 3 times, but refusing to give up. On the 4th try, the napkin became a heart. Leah gave 2 thumbs up, her sign for well done. Eva burst into laughter, light, clear, unforced. For the first time since she'd walked into this diner, Caleb saw her truly relax. He kept chopping carrots, but his hands slowed. A memory surfaced the first time June taught him how to fold napkins into swans for their anniversary dinner at the restaurant. She failed 3 times too, but her smile that night made him fall in love all over again. That afternoon, Eva didn't leave in a hurry. As the last few customers filtered out, she stood and began helping Caleb wash dishes. He refused, as always, but she didn't listen.
I don't like feeling like I owe anyone. Let me do something.
You don't have to repay anything.
But I want to.
They stood side by side at the sink, one rinsing, one drying. Leah sat nearby, drawing the two of them. She added a round lamp overhead, glowing in the shape of a heart. She pinned the picture on the wall right next to June's photo. Caleb saw it, said nothing. But that night after Leah fell asleep, he sat alone in the kitchen staring at the drawing for a long time. He didn't know what to feel. Eva was kind, that much was obvious. There was something in her eyes that stirred a quiet empathy. She didn't intrude, didn't take. But her presence felt too natural, too perfectly timed, as if guided by an invisible hand. He began noticing details, the way Eva looked at Leah, not like a broken child, but like a whole person. The way she offered comfort, not through words, but simply by being there. The way she didn't shy away from June's photo, sometimes pausing to gaze at it, as if silently apologizing to the woman in the frame. But maybe that was why Caleb started to feel afraid. Not of Eva, of himself. He couldn't afford to trust again, not after what he'd lost, not when his only daughter was attaching herself to Eva in a way that made him afraid that if she disappeared, Leah would break all over again. One rainy weekend, Eva arrived later than usual. Her coat was soaked hair, unkempt, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Caleb saw it instantly. She hadn't slept. He didn't ask. But after handing her a cup of ginger tea, he sat down beside Leah, pretending to help color, then whispered gently.
Is she okay?
Leah paused, didn't look up, didn't answer. She quietly set down her pencil, wiped her hands and walked toward Eva, who sat against the wall, eyes distant. Leah climbed onto the bench beside her, took a napkin and gently wiped the rain from Eva's hand. Eva didn't react at first. Then slowly she reached over and held the small hand, not letting go. Caleb turned away. Something had just tapped lightly against his chest, not pain, but a subtle thud that told him he was stepping closer to a wound still healing. That night, after the diner closed, Caleb didn't go upstairs right away. He sat in the kitchen, holding June's photo frame. He stared at it for a long time, then whispered,
What would you say if you saw her here sitting next to Leah? Would you forgive me or?
No answer came. Just the rain on the roof, the soft hiss of the stove, and the flickering candlelight casting his shadow. A man who had loved, who had lost, and who was learning how to protect the one sliver of light he still had. Ridgefield stepped into early winter, wrapped in a thick curtain of fog like velvet draped over the town. The maple trees were bare, the stone-paved roads slick with thin ice, and the sky had all but forgotten the color blue. But inside June's light, the warmth from the gas stove and the gentle simmering of soup created a world of its own, separate, shielded from the rest of life outside. In that space, a child was slowly blooming, not through words, but through subtler signs, eyes, less silent, smiles, more frequent, and small hands beginning to reach out toward the world. Leah, 6 years old, mute since birth. She used to live so closed off that even the father, constantly by her side, couldn't tell what she was thinking. But now Leah was opening up, and the one awakening that change wasn't Caleb, it was Eva. Every morning, Leah woke up before Caleb called her. She dressed herself in a hoodie, slid on her worn soft shoes, hugged her sketchbook and crayon box, and went down to the kitchen to sit in her usual spot by the window where morning light fell sideways, brushing her cheeks with a glow Caleb hadn't seen in months. But there was something new. Leah wasn't drawing alone anymore. She placed a neatly folded napkin beside her Eva's share. Caleb noticed it for the first time on a Monday morning. He thought about asking, but didn't, because in that moment, watching his daughter carefully lay the napkin down, her expression was exactly like June's every time she slipped a sprig of dried lavender into the white ceramic vase, gentle, reverent, full of quiet care. Eva arrived at 8:30, a few raindrops clinging to her coat, her hair tied up neatly. The moment she walked in, she saw Leah waiting, not waving, not speaking, but with a gaze that said hello more softly than any word could. Leah pulled out a chair and motioned for Eva to sit. Caleb watched from behind the counter, still washing greens, but his eyes never left them. Leah handed Eva a freshly drawn picture, not of food or fire, but of two women standing side by side. One tall, one small, their hands gently touching beneath a round, orange-tinted lamp. Eva paused for a moment. Then she placed her hand over her heart, a gesture Leah had taught her just days earlier. It meant thank you. From that day, Leah began teaching Eva how to talk. Every day she would show a new sign, one day for happy, another for sad, then sleep, then friend. Eva learned quickly, not because it was easy, but because she wanted to understand Leah, and deeper still, she wanted to relearn how to connect with someone. Caleb was quietly amazed. Leah had never taught anyone anything before, but with Eva, she was open, patient, willing. Every time Eva got a sign right, Leah would press her thumb to her lips, then draw it gently through the air, a sign that meant beautiful, right, good. And every time Eva would smile, a small smile, but real. One afternoon, when the diner was quiet, Caleb went to the back garden to pick herbs. There, through the rear window, he saw Eva wiping down tables with Leah. The girl was teaching her how to fold a napkin into the shape of a cat, a new design she had invented herself. Caleb stopped at the doorway, not going in. He stood and watched, like someone watching a movie about their own life, no longer playing the lead. After a few tries, Eva missed the final step. The folds slipped, the shape collapsed. She let out a soft laugh and touched her forehead in mock defeat. Leah reached out, gently, took Eva's wrist, repositioned the napkin, adjusted each corner. No words, no scolding, just help. The gesture was so tender, it made Caleb's chest tighten. That night, after Leah had fallen asleep, Caleb sat alone in the living room. He pulled out the old photo album, the one he had hidden since the day June died. Every time he opened it, he felt both revived and torn apart. But tonight, he wanted to remember, not to wallow, but to see again how June used to smile, how she looked at Leah when she was just learning to crawl, how she wiped Caleb's tears the day he failed in New York. And he wondered, would June be angry if he let another woman into this kitchen? The next morning, Leah pulled Eva over to the wall of drawings, pointed at the very first one, the picture of the two figures in the rain, then made the sign for you and me. Caleb knew then that things had shifted. Leah had chosen Eva not with words, but with her heart. And for a child who had never chosen anyone before, that meant everything. Caleb knew he couldn't pretend not to see it, but he also knew he couldn't let trust return too easily. He had lost too much already. He didn't have the strength to lose more, not when what might be lost this time wasn't just memory, but the fragile trust his daughter had just begun to rebuild. Early winter draped Ridgefield in a quiet stillness. Thick fog clung to rooftops like velvet cobblestone paths, shimmered with thin frost, and the sky had all but forgotten its color. Yet inside June's light, the stove crackled steadily, the soup murmured in gentle bubbles, and a small world kept turning, slow but steady. In that kitchen, the warmth came not just from the flame, but from something else, something returning cautiously to the heart of a man who had long since closed it off. Caleb. For 3 years he had been surviving more than living. June's death had left a wound so deep that everything after turned dim. He raised Leah in silence, anchored by the routines of tea in the morning bowls of the same soup and quiet nods in place of words. But when Eva arrived, things began to shift, not loudly, not suddenly, but with a quiet persistence like water seeping through stone. She didn't try to enter, didn't try to replace. She was simply there, present, patient, sincere. Caleb started to notice he no longer looked away when she met his eyes. He didn't feel the need to keep his distance. What began as casual remarks about food, about spices, about Leah, slowly became real conversations.
You know this corn soup was June's favorite. She always added a pinch of black pepper to lift the flavor.
I can taste the love in every spoonful. Thank you for sharing that.
These little exchanges became part of the day. Caleb began to look forward to Eva's visits, not just because Leah lit up when she came, but because something in him softened too. One quiet afternoon, as the diner emptied, Caleb invited Eva into the kitchen. He had just finished baking his first apple pie of the season, following one of June's old recipes.
I'm not sure it's as good as when June made it, but I'd really like you to try it.
I'd be honored, thank you.
Eva took a bite, her eyes lighting up.
It's wonderful. I can feel the care and memories in every bite.
Caleb smiled. For the first time in a long while, speaking of June didn't tighten his chest. Leah entered the kitchen and saw the two of them talking, laughing. She walked over, gently took Eva's hand and led her outside, then pointed to her newest drawing. 3 people sitting together, a soft light glowing above them. Caleb looked at the picture and something in his heart ached. Leah was dreaming of a home, and somehow Eva had become part of that dream. That night, after the lights were off and the doors locked, Caleb stayed behind in the kitchen. He looked up at June's photo on the wall and whispered,
I don't know what's happening, love, but I think my heart is waking up. I hope you'd understand.
He knew the past couldn't be changed, but the present could be lived and the future perhaps rewritten. And in that future, maybe just maybe Eva was becoming someone he didn't want to live without. On Eva's 16th visit to June's light Ridgefield, remained cloaked in a cold mist thick like watered-down milk. The fog clung to the windows to coat hems to the fingers on Eva's left-hand fingers that hadn't worn a ring in a long time. Leah greeted her with a soundless smile, a nod filled with anticipation. Caleb no longer seemed distant, but Eva could feel it clearly. A thin sheet of glass, colourless, shapeless, cold, still stood between them. It hadn't shattered, but it was there. The diner was quiet that day. Eva stayed longer at Leah's side than usual. She practiced napkin folding, learned 2 new signs, careful and dream. Leah drew a special picture, a man standing beneath a leafless maple tree holding a photo frame. Behind him, in a soft glow, stood a woman. Eva held the drawing. Her heartbeat skipped. She was no stranger to images of grief in hospitals, on discharge notes, in the eyes of families when the doctor had to shake their head. But what she couldn't look away from now was something visceral. The woman in the drawing had long shoulder-length hair. Just like the woman in Eva's memory, one she had never truly forgotten. That evening, after the diner closed, Caleb and Eva stayed to clean the kitchen. Leah was already asleep upstairs, curled beneath a thick blanket. In the soft kitchen light, Eva finally asked what she had held in her chest for over a week.
Caleb, can I ask you something about June?
Caleb looked up from the sink, paused, then gave a quiet nod.
She was a teacher. She loved books, light children, and rainy afternoons. She used to say she wanted to open a small diner where people were served with dignity, not just food.
Eva stood still, her fingers clutching the edge of a dish towel. She nodded, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to, the story, the memory, or the dread creeping up her chest.
You said she passed away during surgery. Where?
Portland, St. Mary Hospital, emergency heart surgery. They called me at midnight. By the time I got there, she was already in the OR. And then, she never woke up.
That last sentence drained the blood from Eva's face. She turned away, pretending to tidy some glasses, but her hands trembled so much she nearly dropped one. Caleb didn't notice. He kept washing. But Eva knew her worst suspicion had just been partly confirmed. That night, she returned home and opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing June McAllister, death record, St. Mary, Portland. And there it was, cold as stone, June Elise McAllister, born 1987, passed away March 2022. Medical note: deceased during emergency heart surgery at St. Mary Hospital, Portland. Attending surgeon Eva Beaumont, MD. Her name, there in black and white. A clean wound made by a single line of text. Eva collapsed into a chair. She couldn't breathe. One hand pressed over her chest as if holding her heart in place. She reread the report. Cause unknown. No technical error. But the patient never woke up. Eva had written that report in 3 hours, then sat by the bed for 5 more alone. No one beside her, no words of comfort. It was the last surgery she ever performed, and now she knew that woman was Caleb's wife, Leah's mother. The next morning, Eva still went to the diner. No one knew what was happening inside her. She smiled, folded napkins, learned new signs, talked with Caleb as always, but every gesture carried a new tremble. Leah drew a picture. This time, the woman stood between 2 children, one laughing, one crying. Eva didn't understand. But for the first time, Leah didn't hand her the drawing. She folded it and placed it gently into her wooden box, then sat in silence. That night, Eva couldn't sleep. She paced around her apartment, rereading June's medical file at least 5 times. Every word echoed in her mind like metal striking a wall. She saw again the look in Caleb's eyes when he spoke of his wife. She remembered the way Leah held her hand. And she felt it fully. She was no longer an outsider. She was the one who unknowingly, but directly, had cut the thread that held that family together. And she didn't know what to do. To confess it would destroy everything. To stay silent, that was becoming impossible. The next day, Eva didn't come to the diner. Caleb waited, but didn't call. Leah sat alone, sketching a circle again and again with no shape, no end. Caleb asked her something. Leah didn't answer. He didn't understand what was wrong. Eva stayed home writing a letter she never sent. In it, she told everything: the patient's name, the night of the surgery, the fear and the apology she had never dared to speak aloud. If you're reading this, it means I didn't have the courage to tell you, face to face. I was the surgeon. I was the last person to see June alive. I can't undo what happened. But if I could, I would kneel and say, I'm sorry for everything. Eva folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing: time was running out. The next morning, Eva woke with a weight pressing against her chest. Pale sunlight slipped through the curtains, falling on an old photo of her with colleagues at St. Mary Hospital. She knew she couldn't keep running. It was time to face the past. She drove to Portland, the city where she had once lived and worked. Familiar streets passed outside the window, but inside, her everything felt tangled and uneasy. She parked in front of St. Mary Hospital, the place she had once given her youth to. Walking into the main lobby, Eva was immediately met with the sterile scent of disinfectant, the hurried footsteps of nurses, and the distant sound of the overhead announcements. Nothing had changed, and yet she knew she had. She made her way to the medical records department where patient histories and surgical archives were kept. There she saw Linda, an old colleague she hadn't spoken to in years.
Hi, Linda. It's been a while. I need to look up an old patient file.
Eva, wow, it's good to see you. Which file do you need?
June McAllister. She died during an emergency heart surgery in March 2022.
Linda gave her a concerned look, but nodded and led her into the archive room. Together, they found June's file. Eva opened it slowly and began reading. Every line of text brought back painful memories. She remembered the night of the surgery, the emergency call, the rush to prepare, the mounting dread as the operation began to veer off course. She reached the page with her own surgical report. The words patient did not regain consciousness after surgery struck like a blade. Guilt and sorrow surged inside her. Eva left the hospital heavy with emotion. She drove to a small café nearby, one she and June had once visited. She remembered their short conversation, June's warm smile, her quiet optimism. Sitting at a window seat, Eva wrote a letter to Caleb. She laid out everything from the surgery to her fear to the weight she had carried ever since. She apologized. She asked for forgiveness. When she finished, she folded the letter and slipped it into her coat pocket. She knew facing Caleb would not be easy, but she also knew she could no longer carry this alone. Back in Ridgefield, Eva returned to June's light. Leah was drawing as usual. Caleb was wiping down tables. Eva stepped inside, heart pounding.
Caleb, I need to talk to you.
Caleb looked at her, his expression unreadable. They stepped outside, away from anyone who could hear.
I was the surgeon who operated on June. I didn't know until recently. I'm so sorry.
Caleb said nothing at first. His face was still. After a moment, he spoke.
Thank you for telling me. I need time.
Eva nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but at least she had begun with the truth. The morning after Eva spoke the truth, it rained again. Ridgefield rain never came in storms. It didn't crash or roar. It whispered down quietly, clinging to windows, trickling along wooden eaves, soaking the earth and now soaking into Caleb's chest like a memory that hadn't finished grieving. Caleb sat alone in the kitchen of June's light, stirring a cup of cold coffee. He couldn't name the feeling inside him. It wasn't anger, but it wasn't forgiveness either. It felt like someone tapping gently on an old wound, not enough to tear it open, just enough to remind him it was still there. On the counter were two neatly folded napkins. Leah had prepared them earlier, one for herself, one for Eva. No one had told her to. No one had to. Caleb knew his daughter had never done that for anyone else. He thought of Eva's eyes the night before. No tears, no excuses, just courage and truth. That made it harder. If she had run, maybe he could have hated her. But she hadn't. June used to say, "Some pain doesn't need fixing, only sharing." Caleb wasn't sure he was ready to share anything, but he knew silence wouldn't help Leah find her place in this world. Small footsteps came down the stairs. Leah walked into the kitchen carrying her sketchbook and her worn box of crayons. She placed them on the table, sat down, and looked at him. Caleb poured her a glass of milk. She said nothing. But after a moment she reached out, tugged at his sleeve, and pointed to the two napkins on the table. "Do you understand, Dad?" He nodded.
Today, I'll make the soup your mom loved the most. Want to help?
Leah smiled, her eyes lighting up, and nodded firmly. Caleb rose to gather the ingredients. His hands still trembled slightly, but his heart felt lighter. Maybe it was Leah's look. Maybe it was knowing he wasn't alone. Eva hadn't run. Leah was still here, and he still had a choice. Outside, the rain kept falling, but this time it didn't feel as cold. Beneath the kitchen light, surrounded by the scent of sweet corn and sautéed onions, three people, each carrying their own quiet weight, were slowly learning how to stay, not because they had forgotten the past, but because they understood some things can't be said and still can be understood. This morning, Ridgefield was wrapped in a fine mist of rain. The rain didn't fall, it drifted, quietly, from one roof to another, from eaves to window panes, as if the whole town were holding its breath, guarding a secret not yet ready to be spoken. Caleb opened the diner as he always did. Same gestures, switching on the kitchen lights, checking the stew pot, brewing the coffee. Leah came down later than usual, hair tousled, eyes still heavy. She climbed into her seat by the drawing table, didn't reach for her crayons, just rested her chin in her palms, gazing out the window. Eva hadn't come. This was the second day she'd been absent. Caleb said nothing, but his eyes lingered on the front door longer than usual. Then the bell above the door rang. Not Eva. It was Sam. Sam Evans, surgeon, old friend of Caleb's since med school, and once a colleague of Eva's at St. Mary Hospital. Tall, sun-worn skin, bundled in a heavy coat and navy scarf. He walked in carrying cold air and a heavy expression.
Sam, when did you get here?
This morning, I didn't call. Some things aren't meant to be said over the phone.
Caleb frowned. He had never seen Sam this serious, Not the professional kind of serious, but the kind that came before opening the door that couldn't be closed again.
Want something to drink?
No, I won't stay long.
Sam glanced around. Leah had already stood up and walked into the back, sensing somehow that what was about to be said wasn't for children. When the room was empty, Sam let out a breath.
Has she told you?
Told me what?
About the surgery, about June, that Eva was the one who operated on her.
Caleb froze, not from the news, but from the fact that Sam knew, and hadn't said a word.
You knew.
I was the one who signed the post-op report. Eva was the lead. The patient's name was abbreviated so you wouldn't have known, but I did. And when I saw her here with Leah with you, I couldn't keep it to myself anymore.
Caleb turned and walked out to the front porch, no coat. Rain hit his face, cut through his shirt, but didn't clear his mind. He saw Eva again in his thoughts, Leah holding her hand, learning signs, smiling silently. Eva, standing before June's photo, saying nothing but speaking through her eyes. And himself trusting her truly for the first time since June. Sam followed him out. He didn't speak, just pulled a document from his coat pocket, a printed scan of the surgery report. Name, June Elise McAllister. Surgeon Eva Beaumont. Caleb took it. His eyes landed on the signature at the bottom, the same signature he'd seen on Leah's napkin notes on scraps left behind.
When did she know?
Not sure, but once she did, she didn't leave. She stayed.
She stayed, after everything.
Eva didn't kill June. That surgery, it was impossible. No one could have saved her. But she tried. I was there, I know.
Caleb sat down on the step. The paper crumpled in his hand. Rain rolled down his jaw. What he felt now wasn't anger, it was something heavier, a clash between what his mind screamed and what his heart still held.
Why didn't you tell me sooner?
Because I hoped Eva would be the one to tell you. And because I saw Leah smile again. I saw you smile again, but now I think you deserve to know everything.
Caleb looked up, his hair soaked, but his eyes were dry. Through the diner window, Leah was watching her tiny hands pressed against the glass, waiting.
She already told me, yesterday.
Sam nodded as if he'd guessed that.
Then, what will you do?
Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked down the street. A delivery truck turned the corner, leaving faint tire lines on wet pavement. And somewhere in his chest, a different question was forming. Do I still have the courage to hold on to what's left? Sam placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. No advice, no judgment, just presence.
I'm here if you need me.
Caleb nodded. He stood, walked back inside. Leah ran to him, wrapped her arms around his leg. He crouched down and hugged her tightly. No words. But in that silence something was beginning to form. Not a full decision yet, but enough to not let go. Leah didn't know how to name her sadness. To her, emotions came in colors. Blue was calm, orange was warmth, red was joy, and gray. Gray was what had been clinging to her fingers for the past 3 days. Eva hadn't come back. No one said why, no one said she wouldn't. But children, especially those who cannot speak, are often the first to feel when a rhythm in life has quietly broken. On the third morning, Leah sat by the window, opened her sketchbook and placed 2 napkins side by side, just like she used to. One for herself, one for Eva. She folded the napkin into a heart, aligned it carefully and waited. Half an hour later, her father stepped out from the kitchen and set a mug of warm milk in front of her. He didn't say anything. Leah didn't look up. She only placed her fingers on the table's edge, lightly scratching it with her nails, a habit Caleb recognized from the days after June passed. He saw it. He hesitated, then spoke quietly.
Eva's busy today.
Leah nodded, but her eyes drifted off as if something inside had cracked, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably. Around noon, with the cafe nearly empty, Caleb stepped out and sat across from her. She was drawing. But this time it was different. No colors, only pencil. Cross-hatched strokes circling tighter and tighter into a closed loop. No characters, no scenes, just a circle like a cage. Caleb felt a sharp pinch in his chest. He wanted to say something, but Leah closed the sketchbook, stood up, and walked straight upstairs. That entire afternoon, she didn't come back down. She didn't draw, she didn't speak, and Caleb had no idea what to do. That night, when he went to her room, she was already asleep under the blanket. The nightlight was still on. Beside her pillow lay the sketchbook, and on the floor, the page from earlier, torn out, crumpled. Caleb picked it up, smoothed it open, and for the first time, fear rose clearly in his heart. Leah was losing her way. The next morning, Leah wasn't at her usual seat. Caleb called for her. No answer. He ran upstairs. Her coat was gone. The back door hung ajar. His heart dropped. He ran outside, calling her name, though he knew she couldn't hear. He asked neighbors. No one had seen her. Florist, number pharmacy, number elementary school, no. Nearly 30 minutes later, he remembered the wooden bench by the lake where Eva once sat to write letters, where she taught Leah the sign for sister. He sprinted there, lungs burning. And there she was, sitting alone, clutching her sketchbook, leaning her head against the bench rail. On the table in front of her, a new drawing, this one filled with color. A grown-up and a child sitting across from each other. Between them, a question mark. Caleb slowed his steps. He sat beside her, didn't speak. Leah didn't look at him either. She simply reached out, took his hand, and pulled it close, a silent plea that broke him open. He held her tightly and whispered,
I'm sorry for not knowing how to explain, for still learning how not to run away.
Leah didn't move. But from her pocket, she pulled out something small, a white heart-shaped chalk piece, Eva's gift. She placed it in his hand, looked at him, waited. Caleb nodded. He understood. Leah didn't need apologies. She needed Eva, not because she didn't love her father, but because for a child who had never spoken a word, presence was the only language she trusted. And in that moment, Caleb knew he had to make a choice, not for June, not for himself, but for the small light in his arms, waiting for someone to touch her heart without ever saying a word. The Ridgefield night rain didn't come in anger. It fell quietly, thin, steady drops, like someone knocking gently on every rooftop, asking, "Is anyone still awake? Is anyone still waiting for someone to return?" Caleb didn't sleep. He sat in the kitchen downstairs, the soft yellow light pooling across the scarred wooden counter. The soup pot still gave off a faint warmth. Leah was asleep upstairs, or so he believed. She hadn't spoken all evening. No drawings, no signs, not a single step into the kitchen, even after Caleb had made her favorite meal. Around 11, a sudden gust of wind swept in from the back door. Caleb turned, and his heart dropped. The back door was wide open. Rain was falling harder now, and Leah's yellow coat was gone from the hook. He dashed upstairs, shouting,
Leah, Leah.
No answer. The room was empty, pillow fluffed, blanket cold, window slightly open. On the desk, a drawing, a small boat on a lake with a child sitting inside, looking toward a figure in the distance, walking away. Caleb ran out of the cafe. No coat, no phone. Rain slapped his face. He raced through the main streets, past the flower shop, the pharmacy, the church, everywhere Leah had ever gone with her mother or with him. No one had seen a 6-year-old girl walking alone in the rain. His chest tightened, thoughts spiraling into worst-case scenarios. Slipped into the lake, lost in the woods, a car that didn't stop in time. He reached the local police post. They dispatched flashlights, split into search groups near the water. One officer asked,
Does she trust anyone besides you?
Caleb didn't hesitate. He pulled out his soaked phone, hands trembling. There was only one name he could think of, one person Leah might come back for Eva. The line rang once, twice, then a tired, familiar voice answered.
Caleb.
Leah's gone.
Silence on the other end, then
Has she said anything lately, somewhere she wanted to go?
She drew a boat on the lake.
Eva didn't ask anything else. 10 minutes later, as Caleb was sprinting toward the lake shore, she appeared. No raincoat, no umbrella, hair drenched but eyes glowing with fierce clarity. They met each other's gaze for a second. No apologies, no explanations, just understanding. and together they stepped into the dark. The two followed the narrow trail along the lake, the one kids often played on during warmer summers. Flashlights swept over roots, branches, undergrowth. The rain merged with their breathless exhales. Near a fallen log by the shoreline, Caleb stopped.
Wait.
He tilted his head and heard it, a faint sound, a sniffle, a small hand brushing against damp wood. They turned the light, and there she was. Leah curled up in the hollow of an old wooden rowboat, head on her knees, holding a smooth, heart-shaped stone, Eva's gift. Soaked through, not crying, just still. When the light touched her, she looked up. Her eyes weren't scared, weren't angry, just empty. Caleb rushed forward, dropped to his knees and wrapped her in his arms. Eva stood nearby, hands clenched, as if one wrong move would shatter the fragile stillness. Leah didn't hug back at first. She held out the stone, like a question. Caleb pulled her close and whispered,
I'm here, baby. I'm sorry. Please don't run from me again.
Eva stepped forward, kneeling beside them. She reached out, not to touch, just to be near. Her hand hovered gently beside Leah's cheek. Leah looked at her, and for the first time in many days, nodded. Just once. They stayed like that beneath Ridgefield's midnight rain, inside an abandoned boat shelter. No promises, no answers. But for the first time, 3 people, each carrying their own wounds, chose to stay together. That night, the rain in Ridgefield fell harder than usual, as if even the sky could no longer hold back its tears. At the lake dock, each drop landed with a hollow thud on the rusted tin roof of an old fishing boat where Leah sat, curled up into the smallest version of herself. She wore an old olive coat. Her hair clung wet to her forehead. In her arms was her soaked sketchbook, the yellow on the cover, bleeding into a blur, her last drawing before she disappeared. In the freezing darkness, footsteps echoed down the wooden path to the dock, urgent, unsteady, and a voice, not loud, not clear, but breaking apart in the throat of a father who thought he had already lost his child.
Leah!
He ran toward her, slipping on the slick boards. Eva was close behind, mud-stained, coat-drenched, hair, hands trembling from either cold or fear. Caleb's flashlight swept across the bow of the old boat and stopped at the pale face of his daughter. Her eyes were wide, empty. But when the light reached her, she blinked, as if something inside had just awakened. Eva reached her first. She said nothing, didn't cry aloud. She simply wrapped Leah in her arms, a tight, trembling embrace, as if trying to transfer warmth from one broken heart to another.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have left. I was wrong, Leah. I was wrong.
The words came in gasps, tangled in breath and rain, but they reached something inside the little girl. Leah didn't cry. She just leaned into Eva's shoulder, her arms slipping around Eva's back. And in that fragile moment, one woman, one girl, held each other, as if the world outside no longer existed. Caleb stood frozen, pulled out of time. All sound faded except Eva's breath, Leah's silent sobs, and the steady rhythm of rain falling on his back, reminding him he wasn't as strong as he thought. He stepped forward, knelt beside them. His hand rested on Eva's shoulder, the first time he had touched her in days. Eva looked up. Her face was worn, her eyes red, and a tear clung to her lashes, waiting to fall.
I don't know where to begin. But if I had lost her tonight, I don't think I would have ever forgiven myself.
Eva nodded. Tears slipped freely now.
I know. You have every reason to hate me, but I'll stay. Even if you turn me away. Even if this whole town does. I won't leave. As long as Leah still needs me.
Caleb looked into her eyes, long and quiet. There were no verdicts. No immediate forgiveness. Only the shared presence of 2 people who had both lost too much and were holding on to the one thing left, a child named Leah. He pulled them both into his arms, not knowing what tomorrow would bring, not needing to, just existing in that fragile, vital moment where something had been saved, where something had returned. They brought Leah home, bathed her in warm water, changed her clothes, warmed her hands by the kitchen stove. She didn't speak, didn't draw, but she never let go of Eva's side. When Caleb offered her warm milk, she only turned her head and leaned into Eva's shoulder. That night, Caleb laid out a blanket beside Leah's bed. Eva slept there for the first time in the home of a man who had once sworn he'd never let anyone into his small protected world. Caleb sat on the stairs back against the wall, listening to the steady breath of two women in the next room. And he knew tonight the light named June was burning again. Not in memory, but in those who had survived. Morning came. Ridgefield woke in mist. The kitchen at June's light was quiet, the faucet dripping, the gas stove clicking to life. Caleb followed the same routine: black coffee, 2 slices of toast, a pot of soup, simmering from early dawn. But today, something had shifted. When he turned around, Eva was at the window, her hands wrapped around the thin scarf Leah had left behind the night before. Her hair was tied back. Dark circles still marked her eyes. But the panic was gone. She looked steadier, like someone who had weathered a storm. Caleb handed her a cup of hot ginger tea. She took it without a word. They sat across from each other, no Leah between them, for the first time, a conversation without a translator.
I once thought I'd never forgive. Not anyone. Not fate. Not the doctor who touched June's heart the last time. But I was wrong.
Eva looked up. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup.
I was wrong because I thought I was protecting Leah by closing every door. But I didn't see that in doing so I was also locking the path she needed to find the light again.
Caleb, I don't need your forgiveness right away. I just want to stay long enough to prove I'm not here to replace anyone. I only want to be Eva, the person Leah trusts, the one learning how to understand her.
He looked at her, not taking back his words, not adding more. But his silence wasn't a wall anymore. It was a door, opening just slightly. At 8 o'clock, Leah came downstairs. She carried her sketchbook as usual, but instead of going to her window seat, she walked straight to Eva and handed it to her. Today's drawing held only 3 figures, no rain, no lamplight, just 3 people around a stove cooking together. Eva's eyes filled with tears. She looked down and signed. Family. Leah nodded. Caleb stood behind them, holding a napkin. He folded it into the shape of a star, placed it gently on the table and whispered like a prayer.
June once said there's no perfect family, only people who refuse to give up on each other.
The 3 of them began to clean and prep for the day. Eva learned how to chop onions without crying. Leah giggled silently at her scrunched-up face. Caleb seasoned the soup and let Eva add the last touch, a spoonful of fresh cilantro. The kitchen filled with warmth, not the scent of memory, but the smell of the present being cooked slowly with sincerity. Before opening the door, Caleb pinned a new drawing of Leah's to the wall. Today's, signed for the first time in her handwritten sign language, Leah. Eva stood beside him watching. They said nothing. But as Caleb turned away, his hand brushed lightly against hers, a quiet, brief touch. But enough. Enough to say, from now on, no one would walk through the rain alone again. The cold arrived early that year. Snow had yet to fall, but the chill had already seeped into every crack of the cobblestone streets, slipped through window panes and whispered through the bare branches of pine trees. The town curled into itself, wrapped in a quiet grey hush, as if bracing for something unspoken. But inside June's light, the small diner on the corner, the stove still burned warm. Napkins were still folded into the shape of hearts, and Leah, the silent 6-year-old girl, was once again waking up early, just as she always did. There was one change. Eva was now part of that rhythm. She arrived before the diner opened, no longer a customer, no longer a stranger. She wore an apron painted by Leah herself, dots of yellow, soft blue, and pale violet, scattered like sunflecks across the fabric on a cold day. Caleb had let her into the kitchen. For the first time in years, he shared the space he once considered sacred, where the wooden ladle June used still hung, where every pot of soup felt like a wordless poem, where he once believed no one else would ever be allowed to touch. Eva was a slow learner. Her hands weren't used to big knives. She chopped onions unevenly, sometimes burned the garlic, sometimes forgot the salt. But each time she made a mistake, Leah didn't laugh. She would simply walk over and draw a simple sign on Eva's hand. Try again. And Eva always did, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she wanted to be worthy of the space opening up before her, the kitchen of a man who had lost his wife and of a child who hadn't called anyone mother since that day. On the third Thursday afternoon, Caleb handed Eva a thin book, Sign Language for Beginners. He placed it on the table without a word. Eva picked it up, her eyes lighting. She understood it was a test, and a quiet yes. That evening, Eva sat beside Leah at the table, learning one sign at a time. Eat, sleep happy, sad father, sister, stay. Leah taught with patient hands and a serious face like a tiny teacher guiding the world. Caleb watched from behind the counter, seeing his daughter, the one who had once hidden in her shell, now reaching out to the world, teaching grown-ups a language without sound. One afternoon, Leah pointed at the wedding photo on the wall, June and Caleb smiling beneath soft autumn light. She signed to Eva, pretty. Eva nodded. She drew a heart in the air, then added another sign, your mother. Leah nodded again. Eva pressed her hand to her chest, then signed, I miss her even if we never met. Leah didn't reply. She took Eva's hand and placed it gently on the photo as if offering an official introduction. That night, Caleb sat alone in the storage room, flipping through June's old journal. On one of the last pages she had written, if one day I'm no longer here, I hope you still make soup every morning. And if someone ends up sitting by the kitchen table, tasting the sweetness of corn and the warmth of golden onions with you, let them stay. Not for me, for you. Caleb closed the journal, and for the first time, his eyes didn't sting. The next day he handed Eva a new knife, not to cut faster, but to say she belonged in the kitchen now too.
It's not too sharp, but it's enough to start.
Just like me.
They both laughed. Leah looked up from her sketch, smiled silently, and signed together. From then on, Eva became part of the diner, not as an employee and certainly not a guest, but as someone learning day by day how to live again, how to love again, and how to listen. Mornings in the small town grew longer as winter loosened its grip. Though frost still misted the windows of June's light inside the kitchen, laughter had begun to return, quiet at first, scattered but unmistakably real. Eva now woke early every day. No more nightmares, no more scrubbing her face 3 times to erase the phantom of blood on her hands, blood that had only ever lived in memory. Now her hands were full with kneading dough, folding napkins, learning to carve carrots into flowers under Leah's careful instruction. These daily rituals, prepping the kitchen with Caleb, setting tables with Leah, became a kind of therapy no doctor could prescribe. On a quiet Thursday morning, Caleb handed Eva a recipe for pecan pie, the one June had created, the one no one had made since the funeral. Eva took the page, reading each round, handwritten letter as if holding June's hand for the first time.
Are you sure?
She once said, if anyone else ever touches this recipe, it should be someone who knows it's not meant to impress, but to remember.
Eva nodded, eyes glassy. She measured the ingredients carefully, precisely, each gram of flour, each pecan. Leah stood beside her, tasting every crumble like a proper critic. She signed good after sampling the golden edge of the crust. The scent of warm sugar and spice filled the kitchen, chasing away the frost clinging to the glass. When the pie emerged from the oven, golden and cracked, just slightly in the center, Caleb looked at it for a long moment. He reached out, brushing his finger across the crust, not to check for doneness, but as if touching a memory that had never really left.
You did it.
Eva said nothing. Her hands were still covered in flour, but her eyes glowed not with guilt this time, but with something returning. That same day, Caleb asked her to sign her name on the chalkboard menu.
Write pecan pie by Eva at the bottom. People should know who made this.
Can I add something?
What?
Eva picked up a piece of white chalk and carefully wrote on the corner of the board, inspired by June, with love and respect. Caleb read it, then nodded. He didn't say anything, just handed her a colored chalk to make the line bolder. After that day, customers started asking for the pie more often. No one inquired too much about who made it. They just said it tasted warm, real like autumn resting in your palm. One slow afternoon, Eva was polishing glasses. Caleb was adjusting the gas line in the back. Leah, perched at the table, was folding napkins into fish shapes, her latest invention. Suddenly Eva looked up.
Caleb, if I had succeeded that day, if June had lived, do you think you and I would have ever met?
Caleb didn't answer right away. He set down the wrench, wiped his hands on a towel and walked over. He didn't look at her. He looked up at the photo of June, and beside it, Leah's drawing of Eva beside 2 bowls of soup.
I don't know. But if that had happened, maybe you and Leah wouldn't have met, and that, I'm not sure I could accept.
Eva smiled softly. She didn't need anything more. They stood beside each other, not touching, but the space between them no longer felt guarded. Just 2 people, both broken, both healing, standing still, learning how to walk forward. Caleb returned to the kitchen. Eva went back to drying glasses. Leah climbed onto her chair, drew a few new lines, and handed the paper to Eva. She read it slowly. Simple signs, nothing complicated, but she understood. And she signed back, "Me too." That drawing, Eva and Caleb in the kitchen, Leah between them, was taped on the wall next to June's photo. No one asked why, but anyone who walked into the diner could feel it. This place wasn't just about the past anymore. It was a home growing in the present, built with warmth, forgiveness, and the kind of love that doesn't need to be spoken aloud. It was the last Saturday of the month, and Ridgefield had sun, a rare gift in winter. Soft light filtered through the thick glass of June's light, falling gently on the drawings pinned to the wall, making every color seem to stir and breathe. Eva washed her hands after the morning prep, drying each finger, with the precision of a habit long rooted in old hospital routines. But instead of returning to the pastry counter, she removed her apron, slipped on her coat, and looked at Caleb.
I'm taking the morning off. There's somewhere I need to go.
Caleb looked at her for a long moment. He didn't ask where, but his eyes softened, and he nodded, quiet permission, no words needed. Eva drove south. The address in her pocket came from one of June's old journals, the home of her parents Elliot and Marion Hughes. A small wooden house nestled into a hillside nearly 2 hours from Ridgefield. When Eva pulled up to the house, her hands were ice. She had walked through countless hospital doors, past waiting rooms, operating theaters, even grief-stricken families, but never had her fingers trembled like this. The door opened. A silver-haired man with a stern expression stood in the frame. Behind him, Marion, smaller, softer, stepped forward, her face wary but still.
My name is Eva Beaumont. I used to be a surgeon at St. Mary's Hospital.
Silence pooled like thick molasses in the doorway. Mr. Hughes didn't invite her in. He stood firm, fists clenched. Marion stepped back, not away, just back.
I was the one who operated on June that day.
Mr. Hughes started to speak, but Eva fell to her knees.
I'm not here to explain, and I know I can't undo anything. I just came to bow my head to the people who trusted a system and lost everything. I brought, if you'll allow, a bundle of dried lavender and an apology.
She reached into her bag and pulled out a small bouquet tied with a soft, purple ribbon, the shade June had always loved, the one Eva had seen in the photo album at the café. Marion reached out slowly and took the bouquet. After a pause, she whispered,
June loved lavender. It used to grow all along the back fence.
Eva bowed lower forehead nearly to the floor.
I don't expect forgiveness, but if I may, I'd like to light a candle for her.
For the first time, Mr. Hughes nodded. He said nothing, just stepped aside. Eva entered the house like she was walking across memory. In the living room, atop a worn wooden cabinet, stood June's photograph placed between 2 candle holders. Eva knelt, lit a stick of incense, and pressed her hands together.
I'm sorry, June, and thank you for letting me know you through Caleb's cooking, through Leah's smile, and through the light that's never stopped glowing in that little kitchen in Ridgefield.
Marion placed a hand gently on Eva's shoulder. She said nothing, But in that touch there was something unspoken, an understanding between two women, one who had lost a child and one who had survived herself. When Eva stepped back outside, Mr. Hughes didn't walk her out, but before he closed the door, he said one thing.
If Caleb's letting you stay, then he must see something worth keeping. Don't prove him wrong.
Eva drove back with tears she didn't try to stop. But her chest felt lighter, like a debt she'd never believed repayable had finally been honored. That afternoon, when she returned to the cafe, Leah was drawing a new picture. The moment she looked up and saw Eva, she ran, without needing to ask anything, and placed a paper lavender flower into her hand cut from an old drawing. Eva hugged her tight. Caleb stood behind the counter silent, but he poured her a cup of ginger tea served on a saucer painted with lavender. And in that moment, Eva understood. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't arrive in words. It lives in silent gestures, in doors that remain open, and in the quiet blooming of a flower you thought would never grow again. Late at night, Ridgefield was as quiet as an unwritten melody. Street lamps cast a soft amber glow. Mist clung to the bare branches, and the cold slipped through every crack in the old wooden walls of June's light. But in the little kitchen the light was still warm. The gas stove whispered its soft flame, not for a dish, but for a moment no one wanted to end. Leah had already fallen asleep, curled under her cat-patterned comforter. One hand clutched her sketchbook, the other resting gently on an unfinished drawing. 3 people in a kitchen, each holding a ladle, their heads haloed in heart-shaped light. Caleb stood at the stove, drying a pan. Eva sat near the oven, warming her hands over a mug of cocoa. Neither had spoken for the last 10 minutes, but silence no longer needed to be filled. The warmth from the stove carved out a small circle of comfort between them, not something easily defined, but something any outsider would recognize. Something was growing. Eva finally broke the quiet, her voice barely a breeze.
I used to think I'd never set foot in a kitchen with anyone again. After my last patient died, I couldn't touch a knife, couldn't cook, couldn't even make tea.
Caleb hung the pan and turned to look at her. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and handed it over. Eva took it, wiping away the condensation from her glass.
But today, when I baked June's pecan pie again, my hands didn't shake. For the first time, I felt alive.
Caleb stepped closer. He didn't sit, didn't touch her. Instead, he picked up a napkin and folded it into a small boat, a design Leah had once taught him.
Leah says boats carry people across rivers, even if you don't know what's on the other side. You just have to believe there's a shore.
Eva smiled. She didn't look at him, just touched the edge of the napkin, a quiet thank you. The kitchen held its peace, but their hearts no longer did. A while later, as Caleb reached for the leftover soup pot, Eva spoke again.
Do you remember what soup you made that first day I walked into this place?
Corn and lotus seed, June's favorite.
I remember its scent, not because it was good, but because it felt safe.
Caleb turned, scooped out a portion and placed it in front of her.
Every time I make this soup, I think of June. But today, I thought of someone who brought it back to life.
Eva lifted the spoon. The scent of corn, fried shallots, and a hint of black pepper rose like a wordless lullaby. When she finished, Caleb set the bowl on the drying rack. He stood behind her, not too close, not too far. Then slowly he said,
If June were still here, what do you think she'd say?
Eva looked to the ceiling as if seeking answers in the old beams.
I think she'd tell you not to lose anyone else just because you're afraid of losing again.
Caleb nodded, just once, then turned, drying his hands. Eva rose, walked to the table and picked up Leah's drawing from that afternoon, 3 people in a golden kitchen. She flipped it over and added one simple sign in brown crayon, an open palm, with a heart inside the sign for hope. Caleb turned back to see her taping the drawing beside June's photograph, to the right of the wedding photo, right where the firelight reached. They stood together, not speaking, but from that shared stillness, something had begun, not sudden, not blinding, just a new light, soft, warm, and real. One late spring evening, after the last guest had left and Caleb was locking the front door, Eva remained at the window table, the same spot where once she had taken shelter from the rain. On the table sat a small wooden box she had brought from home. Leah was already asleep upstairs and Caleb had just finished cleaning the kitchen. Eva said nothing at first. She opened the box and took out a cream-colored envelope, aged its edges worn yet never opened since the day it was written. She placed it on the table and gently slid it toward Caleb.
I wrote this the day I planned to leave Ridgefield.
Caleb paused. He didn't reach for the letter immediately. He looked at her, not with questions, not with demand. Eva lowered her gaze, her voice steady but slow.
I thought disappearing might spare you and Leah more pain, but when I reached the last line, I stopped. I never left, but I also never gave you this letter. Tonight, I want you to read it, if you want to.
Caleb sat down and opened the envelope. Eva's handwriting was neat, trembling, like the hands that once wrote it. He read it line by line, and as he did, her voice rang in his mind, clearer than any word she'd ever spoken aloud. Caleb, I didn't step into your kitchen with courage. I came with fear, fear of being forgotten by a life I no longer understood. I didn't ask for anything more than a place to breathe, but I was given so much more. I saw Leah smile. I saw you step by step begin to trust a stranger again. I was afraid, terrified really, that if you ever knew who I was, it would all vanish. I still don't know if I deserve forgiveness, but I do know this: if I never speak the truth, I will never forgive myself. You once asked me if June were still alive, what would she say? I can't be sure. But I believe she would choose love because it was love that made her believe in this kitchen.
If someday you find yourself reading this letter, please know that I love you. Not as someone who replaces, but as someone who is learning how to love without hiding. Caleb folded the letter, saying nothing. His hands still smelled faintly of toasted bread from the evening, but something inside him felt washed clean, as if the ink itself had reached into the corners of his heart. He looked up, met Eva's gaze. There was no pleading in her eyes, no defense, just the raw honesty of someone who had stripped away every layer and stood open before him.
You should have left this on the table sooner, but maybe, if you had, I wouldn't have learned how to read it with my whole heart.
Eva smiled for the first time, not out of relief, but because she had been understood. Caleb stood, walked closer. He didn't take her hand, didn't lean in to kiss her. He simply pulled from his pocket a small slip of paper, Leah's drawing from that morning, a heart resting between two open hands.
Leah placed this on your table before you went into the kitchen. I think it's her answer.
Eva took the drawing. Tears streamed down her face, not from pain, but as if something deep had finally been cleansed. They didn't say another word, but in that quiet space nothing more needed to be said. The next morning Ridgefield woke to early sunlight. The warmth was faint, carrying a scent like sun-dried pines slipping through the windows of June's light, casting golden beams on the small pots Eva and Leah had planted months ago, lavender, mint, and a touch of rosemary. Caleb brought a tray of vegetables into the kitchen, but paused when he saw Eva at the table, reading through June's handwritten recipe journal, the one he had never shared with anyone else. Leah sat beside her, sketching soft curls on a piece of paper, though her eyes kept glancing at the open page. It was the recipe for sweet corn and lotus seed soup, the first dish June had ever created, the one Caleb always called the light in a bowl.
Would you let me try making this today?
Caleb didn't answer right away. He sat beside her fingers, flipping gently through a few pages, stopping at the note June had scribbled once, "Don't oversalt, just enough to remember."
We'll make it together. But the way she used to one hand each, no helper, no lead.
Leah set her pencil down and signed, "I'll help too." They both nodded. The kitchen began to stir, not with the frenzy of a restaurant, but with the quiet rhythm of a home cooking, not for sustenance, but for memory, for connection, for beginning again. Caleb chopped onions, Eva simmered the broth. Leah washed the lotus seeds and counted them out loud in her own way, tapping 3 times on the table for every 10. the air filled with the scent of boiling corn, freshly cracked pepper, and something else unnamed, as if June herself were walking through the room smiling at the three of them. When the soup was ready and placed on the table, Leah was the first to ladle a bowl. She stirred it gently, took a spoonful, then signed, "Delicious, like Mum." Eva placed her hand over her heart and nodded. Caleb said nothing, only gripped his spoon tighter.
I used to think I'd never cook this dish again, but now I realize. Keeping the recipe is keeping June not as a shadow of the past, but as a heartbeat in every meal we share.
Eva didn't speak. She brought the spoon to her lips, tasted it, then smiled, eyes wet, voice soft.
I think she's proud of us, all three of us.
They ate slowly. No one spoke again, and no one needed to. Leah sat between them, holding a hand on each side, as if she were the bridge between the one who was gone and the two who remained. Outside, the sun climbed higher light, spilling through the cafe's front glass, landing on the sign above the stove, June's Light. Love doesn't end. It cooks on. Late in the afternoon, golden sunlight draped across the eaves of June's Light like a ribbon of honey. Inside the cafe was quiet. Caleb wiped down the tables, Eva folded napkins, and Leah, as always, sat drawing at the window-side table. But today, instead of drawing people, she wrote. Each stroke, each symbol she'd learned over the past year appeared now in vibrant color. She wrote by hand, "Family, Light, Eva." Caleb stood watching, smiling silently. He walked over, sat beside his daughter, and used a napkin to wipe a smudge of color from her cheek.
My girl's becoming quite the artist.
Leah looked at him, then turned toward Eva, who was tending to the small oven baking the last batch of chocolate cookies for the day. The little girl walked slowly, arms cradling her sketchbook. Her wide eyes, framed by long lashes, fluttered as if holding back a secret too big for silence. Eva turned around and sat down, greeting her with the same look she always did, gentle, unhurried, patient to the end.
I'm here, Leah.
Leah pressed her lips together. Her tiny hands trembled. Behind her, Caleb's heart skipped a beat. No one moved, no one urged her on, but the very air in the room seemed to hold its breath. Leah opened her mouth, her voice broke out hoarse, fragile but unmistakably clear. One word, one name, one ray of light.
Eva.
The entire kitchen fell still. Eva burst into tears. She dropped to her knees and pulled Leah into her arms, hands trembling, heart racing.
I'm here. I'm right here, sweet girl.
Caleb didn't step forward right away. He took a step back and wiped his face with his sleeve, but his eyes betrayed the tears, because he knew this was June's final gift. Not written in a will, not scribbled in a recipe, but living quietly in the heart of the daughter they once feared might never speak. Leah spoke the name again, clearer this time. Then she hugged Eva tighter, as if never wanting to let go. On the wall, the last rays of daylight struck the morning's drawing, the one where three figures stood, cooking together. And above them scrawled in handwritten sign, "A family doesn't need to look alike, only to light together." The tiny kitchen, once filled with memories alone, had become the birthplace of a beginning, not perfect, not whole, but honest in every breath. June's Light wasn't just a name, it was a way of living, a reminder that even in loss, even in pain, love can begin again with a hug, a bowl of soup, and a name spoken for the very first time. The story ends here, but the light June once lit continues to shine in every sketch, every spoonful of soup, and in the names spoken for the very first time. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If you believe that love doesn't need to be perfect, just persistent, subscribe to this channel to hear more stories that linger long after the screen fades to black. June's Light is always open. Whether it's rain or sun outside, you're welcome here. See you in the next story.